Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Stephen Salyer, the President and Chief Executive Officer of Salzburg Global Seminar. And it's a great pleasure to be with you for another in Salzburg Global Seminar's signature public affairs series, Designs on the Future. At Salzburg Global, we have examined complex issues for nearly 75 years. Salzburg Seminar number 1 in 1947 explored what it would take to rebuild Europe after 2 world wars within 30 years. Through post-war upheaval, dozens of Salzburg seminars looked at the renewal of education and healthcare, the rule of law and democratic institutions, the rise of mass communications and civil society. Across Designs on the Future, tonight is our 10th in the series. We ask fundamental, expansive questions. Are we still prepared to invest in ideas? Can democracy contend with technology? Who owns the past and the right to create narratives to describe it? Can bringing new voices to the table improve policy outcomes? All these questions force us to think what it will take to shape a more equitable and inclusive world. 75 years since Salzburg Global's founding, we face convergent crises. If we fail to address them, life on Earth may enter a spiral from which there is no escape. As we approach this reckoning, we seem desperately in need of new social enlightenment. We ask ourselves tonight, what might this next enlightenment look like? In Buddhism, enlightenment is the search for truth. The philosopher Immanuel Kant saw enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. He dared us to be wise. At a time when we face enormous global issues threatening the very survival of humankind, where will we find that wisdom? Leading this existential discussion is Salzburg Global's newly arrived Vice President and Chief Program Officer, Elora Julie Parekh. Elora joined us just this month after more than a decade with McKinsey, where she served as Global Director of Regulatory Strategy and of ESG, McKinsey's Environment, Social, and Governance practice, focused on helping international clients renew their social contract, without which there will be no winners, only losers. Please join me in welcoming Elora, to whom I give the digital floor. She will introduce our guests and moderate our conversation. Elora, welcome. Good to see you and looking forward to today's conversation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for the introduction. And it's a true pleasure to be here today and to moderate this 10th Design on the Future webinar. The title for today's discussion is, what will the next Enlightenment look like? I believe we've got close to 300 people registered, truly global, with participants from all the way from Sweden to South Africa or Australia, Argentina, etc. As Stephen was pointing out, we're really at a point of convergence, at an inflection point, with a number of disruptions coming our way. Of course, the COVID pandemic, which has both taken many lives, but also opened opportunities around digitalization. The climate crisis, which is bringing to the front a number of trade-offs and possibly asking the question of, where is capitalism going? And then, of course, structural inequities and injustices inherited from history and again, put forward by recent events. So with all those very complex disruptions, by definition, it is hard to anticipate and to decide how to ride on it. So that's the challenge we'll try to pose today in our discussion. How do we move to more systemic change? However, to also put a positive note to this conversation, I think in France, where I come from, Enlightenment, the century of Enlightenment led largely to some of the thinking that brought the revolution. And so the question for today is also what will be coming from that new Enlightenment that we can expect. The question was initially spurred by a discussion at a Salzburg Global Seminar called The Humanizing Power of the Arts. And we'll try today to take it really beyond the arts to more of the very global challenges that the world is facing today. So we'll explore why we need a new enlightenment, what are the disparities between knowledge systems, what is wisdom, how can we create new wisdom, and what could that look like, what the process might be for defining those new sources of knowledge, and how can it be more fair and just to help us in these disruptive times. So it's quite a big topic to cover, and we have some enlightened speakers, which I'm very pleased to introduce. Vishakha Desai is a Salzburg Global Fellow and Senior Advisor for Global Affairs to the President of Columbia University. She's also the chair of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University. Hi, Vishakha. We also have Yolanda Lopez Maldonado joining us. Yolanda is an Indigenous scholar and systems thinker in integrative science for sustainability. She's working with UNESCO on understanding the social dimensions for nature conservation. Welcome, Yolanda. And then finally, we have Wendell Willock, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, and who co-directs the AI and Equality Initiative. He also coincidentally has a book proposal on Enlightenment 2.0, which is very appropriate for today's discussion. So thank you very much to the three of you for joining us tonight for this conversation. The way we'll run the discussion, so we'll start with 25 or so minutes of open conversation in this group, and then I'll turn to my colleague Antonia to open up and take some questions from the audience, which we'll answer in the following 45 minutes. So maybe to get us started, I opened up saying, we need a new enlightenment, but do we really need it, right? And why do we need it? Is it a new enlightenment? Is it the old enlightenment that needs to be revisited? I think this is maybe a good place for us to start, right? Why do we need it? And Vishakha, I see you nodding your head. Maybe you want to kick us off on this.
Thank you, Elora, and it's such a great pleasure to be with all of you from different parts of the world, and welcome to all of you who are registered from different parts of the world too. It is the conversation that we had in that humanizing power of the arts when I was kind of reflecting on the fact that the idea of enlightenment in itself, on the one hand, has a very strong European background, and that's the Cartesian knowledge. Then at the other side, those of us who are also familiar with the Indic tradition, is also a very Buddhist idea, as Stephen mentioned. And it's a very different notion of enlightenment, that cultivated mind that actually is a wise mind above the reasonable, rational kind of mind. So the question that you asked is the right question, and that is, why do we think that the time has come for us to think about where do we go from here? If you think about even the Buddha in the Indic tradition and Cartesian notions, all of them emerge out of certain upheavals in thinking, in ways of being, from the religious side of things, as it was true for the European tradition, that you go beyond the idea of belief to the idea of reason, the focus on the individual, the focus on science and the scientific inquiry. In the Indic tradition, the Buddha actually was also fighting against the supremacy of the Brahminic tradition, of the priest, that they could be only the intermediaries who could actually lead you to this enlightened being. And he's saying, no, you can do it yourself. That too is revolutionary. Both of them came out of certain level of upheavals in the society. So today it does seem to me, as you pointed out, as Stephen has pointed out, there is a kind of an inflection point. And it's not as if it's just this moment. If COVID really happened, it's not because it has caused all these problems to occur. It has just opened up the vision that actually we've got some serious problems in the world. Climate knows no national borders. COVID has proven that it lives in our body, the world lives in our body. And all of it really suggests that this hyper focus on nationalism, out of which emerged other kinds of wars. And as we talked about the origins of the Salzburg Seminar, that after World War II, people thought, okay, we need to do something multilateral. But all of the multilateral institutions have also shown their limits because they're still focused on national systems. There's also the limits of individualism that we have so focused on. And all of this, I feel, are showing us the limits of the age of reason, the way we have known it. At the same time, as Wendell will talk about, you also have artificial intelligence that's coming and changing our brains at the same time. So there is a moment that actually wouldn't be just a moment, it'll be decades. Even the age of enlightenment in the Buddha's time and the Cartesian times took a long time to evolve. But I do think it's worth thinking about what's missing in our way of thinking. See, this obsessive focus on individualism, the obsessive focus on only reason and cognitive reason as a way of being, has in a way shunted aside other kinds of knowledge systems, indigenous, non-Western traditions. We almost feel like this is a supreme tradition that now is actually showing us a limit. So I actually feel this inflection point requires that we think about what is missing in the way we behave today, and then go about finding some new ways of creating knowledge systems and some will come from things that we've known for 5,000 years, and some will come from things that we can't even imagine. How do we do that? That's why this is the moment to think about how do we go forward.
Yeah, thanks, Vishakha. And I think maybe, Yolanda, when we talk about some systems of belief and some systems of knowledge that actually exist for more than 5,000 years, I think, you're probably very well placed to comment on this. And, we'd love your reaction.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elora and Vishakha for this amazing opening. I have some, because our panelists, we had a previous meeting on Monday to discuss about this, and I have been reflecting a lot about this question of if we need a new enlightenment. And as Vishakha mentioned, this was not a single event in a particular time. This took years and a lot of time to arrive to this point. And my point here is that honestly, we don't have that much time. We cannot wait to a new enlightenment. We need to act now as individuals, but not individualistic, in an individualistic way. So we need to work together. And as Vishakha mentioned, and this is a very wise comment, we need to think beyond ourselves and to place our planet at the center of our decisions every single day, every single second, because our planet is in perish and we are losing important keystone species, biodiversity. Everything is collapsing at this point. And there are other ways of trying to not arrive to that point in which we lost every species in the planet. And one way to do that is by learning other ways of taking care of the planet, other ways of relating to nature and halting the destruction and restoration of ecosystems. And that way to do that is by learning other cultures and other societies, including indigenous peoples and local communities. So I can bring some examples. Being myself an indigenous member, it's important for me to share this way of thinking. For us, nature is our mother nature. So everything we do is related to nature in our actions. And we are not anti-developers, but we really take care of that because we place at the center of our universe all that Mother Nature provides us for our living. So we need to take care of our mother. And we have a different vision of what a well-being or a good life is. For us, it's not to have many cars or to have bigger houses. For us, being in harmony with nature represents something bigger and something more deep. And yeah, I'm sure that there are many ways in which indigenous knowledge systems can be and can go hand by hand with other knowledge systems in order to halt in the destruction of nature. Yeah, so I don't know what Wendell can bring to this amazing conversation.
Thank you, Yolanda. And I think it's an interesting reflection, right? Because when people talk about sort of innovation and sort of new knowledge, oftentimes the first thought is around new technologies and innovation sort of being something new, right? And I think it's interesting to hear also your point of view on, possibly some of the learnings come from the past. And, as I was mentioning just now, I think my father's from India, from a community, the Jain community, which has for years been very much putting nature at the center of the existence, and as it's very famous for the monks walking around with a broom in front of them so that they do not step on a living organism which is not visible on the floor, right? And they've been wearing masks. This has nothing to do with COVID. Obviously, this is to not inhale living organism, right? And so, having sort of grown up between the Cartesian system and that system, very much, like you were both mentioning, I think it really gives us thought to say, well, maybe innovation does not come only from, things in the future and technology, but can also come from things that used to exist and have been forgotten and can be revived in different ways. I think, Wendell, you do work in the space of artificial intelligence, right? Which is in theory exactly the opposite of what we just discussed. And so we'd be very keen to hear your perspective. And I know you have also critical thoughts, obviously, on artificial intelligence, right? And so very curious to hear your perspective on where should we turn? What's the process to get to this new enlightenment? Is it forward-looking? Is it backward-looking? Is it both?
Well, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be with you and on this panel with these esteemed colleagues. Before I jump into artificial intelligence, I'd really like to set a bit of what I think is the stage and how it looks from my perspective. So the 17th and 18th century European intellectual movement, which we now call the Enlightenment, it first arose to compensate for excesses that exist in a Christian-dominated, Aristotelian, ecclesiastical, after-life world philosophies that had been pervasive. And in that compensation, it emphasized humanism, the importance of the individual. It emphasized reason and scientific process, and in effect gave birth to scientific process. And out of that came democracy, came the Industrial Revolution, came capitalism, came tremendous growth in productivity, notions of progress, the Industrial Revolution, and modernity, the modern world that we live in today. And the main reason I think we need a reset is that the world in many ways, the Enlightenment movement is in many ways suffocating under its own success. We all know about how the individual has become supreme In many countries, so often to the expense of the community, capitalism has created tremendous growth, but tremendous inequality, progress, and the ability to sustain 8 billion people on the planet has come at the expense of the environment. So these are just some of the examples, but the one perhaps you have invited me to discuss on this panel is particularly what's happening in the field of scientific discovery and technological innovation, which are giving birth to all kinds of possibilities, some more fanciful, but some very recent, that are disruptive and will continue to be disruptive, may even be going so far as in some melodramatic scenarios as inventing the human species as we know it out of existence. So how are we going to manage this? How are we going to navigate this future? How are we going to navigate a future that has pressing near-term problems and pressing futuristic possibilities that are beyond the kinds of values that the Enlightenment itself bequeathed us, and in some senses in the form of progress may actually be as much a part of the problem as part of the cure. So let me just say a word or two about artificial intelligence, and then I suspect we're going to come back to that in this conversation, but I don't want to take too much time at the moment. There is artificial intelligence and there is artificial intelligence, meaning there are existing and new term technologies subsumed by this term. And there's very fanciful notions about what might be realized and deep arguments about whether those futuristic possibilities that get displayed in science fiction and movies and so forth are truly realizable, and if so, when they might be realized, whether that's within 30 years, 100 years, 500 years, never. So we're talking about something very broad with artificial intelligence. But even when we talk about the near term, we're talking about intelligent capacities that humans have often failed at. So the world champion at the game of Go is now a computer system. More recently, a computer program called AlphaFold solved a protein folding problem, which is beyond our discussion today, but it is a central problem in biology that humans were not able to really solve on their own without the help of artificial intelligence. So in that sense, artificial intelligence becomes a tool we can work with. Now, I happen to be among those who believe that intelligence is not the property of a human being, nor is the property of a machine, and won't be for a long time, that intelligence is really the property of humanity as a whole, and is largely reflected in our ability to work together. We need scholars with transdisciplinary skills, not just narrow mindsets who are able to navigate the many fields that are in play. But we also need to recognize that we need many voices at the table to work through the challenges before us. And some of those voices may be AIs. Those AIs initially will be speaking through experts who can draw upon their data. Whether they go beyond that, that's to be witnessed.
Vishakha, do you have some thoughts to offer?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about what Wendell is saying is this idea of collective intelligence. That in itself is a profound thought, and that therefore there are many forms of intelligence and many different voices that come into play. And how do we actually think about it? I mean, for me, it goes back to this notion of the collective. And that, how do we foster that idea of the collective without sounding autocratic, without sounding that it is all kind of some voice of God that's going to be the collective? And I go back to the book that I just finished, and the title, which is based on an ancient Vedic phrase called Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Now, it's overused, cliched. I almost refused to use that word until I realized how brilliant it was. And that is that if you think about treating the whole world as family, the whole phrase goes something like this, that those of the limited minds think of their blood relatives as their family. But those of the magnanimous mind or the cultivated mind know that they treat the world as family. And the reason why that's so brilliant, I realize, is that it's the latter part. What do we think about a family? Family is where you learn about yourself, but you also learn about being in a group. You learn to know that you can act on your own, but you're also interdependent, that your wellness is also dependent on other people's wellness. And that idea with COVID became so profound for me that I thought, it's about the family as a unit of analysis. If you apply that to the world, what would the world look like? Now that connects Wendell's idea of collective intelligence and Yolanda's idea of human being as part of this ecosystem, the natural ecosystem. So the relational sense of being is what we have really lost. And how do we bring it back? It would require some real serious thinking without giving up necessarily the sense of the individual. It's the collective and the individual that we're going to have to really see, the social and the community and the individual, that we have to really figure out how we go from here.
And we're going to open up the floor very soon, actually. So I'm very much hoping some of the participants might have some ideas to suggest to the question Vishakha was just posing, right? Of saying, what is this new world between collective and individual going to look like? And how do we bridge the gap between those two philosophies, right? Maybe before we do this, one final question from my end, and I'll maybe start with you, Yolanda, right? If we were to put nature back at the center, what could that look like? What would be the benefits? And why is this the right thing to do?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Of course, this is a very complex question for a complex problem, so the answer should be complex as well, but I will try to simplify. I think one of the most important issues here is that we need to think about our daily decisions. And once we do that, we will be able to act as individuals for protection of our planet. And I can give some examples, but I think one important fact is that to bring back, to restore and recover the knowledge that has been lost, in this case, indigenous knowledge systems, with all the historical process indigenous peoples have been suffering over centuries. And this can be one possible solution, because indigenous peoples possess reliable and vast knowledge of the functioning of our planetary systems. And this has been proved by science, and there is scientific evidence that most of our ecosystems, more important ecosystems, are protected by indigenous peoples. So there are some proofs that indigenous peoples have been doing an amazing job protecting the planet, and putting at the center of our lives nature. It's possible by learning by those societies. So this can be one idea, one example, and I'm just thinking here about all this enlightenment process. And for some societies, for some cultures, this enlightenment was a totally different thing. For indigenous peoples, was dispossession of their knowledge, was marginalization, was the loss of their language, of their culture, etc. So it's important to keep also in mind that this enlightenment was a good thing for some, not all of the societies in this world.
Thank you, Yolanda. Maybe Wendell, do you have some thoughts to offer on, what that new enlightenment could look like?
Well, I mean, let me jump into this a little bit, because I think we talk a lot about inclusivity. I think we talk a lot about a more ecocentric viewpoint. I think we talk about the need to recognize the imbalances in existing viewpoints, but I think we also have this problematic that a certain form of individualism is very constructive for those who see that they're going to be the winners in the game. And therefore, oftentimes our discussions about the sustainable development goals, about inclusivity, about being part of a broader ecosystem upon which we depend upon, that may speak to the needs of the majority, but it may not necessarily speak to some of the worldviews that are being put out there right now. And I think we have to call that out. I think we really have to ask people who we perceive as being willing to move in ways that they think serve their needs, but may not serve broader societal needs. We really need to have not only a conversation, but perhaps a confrontation around that. Now, to be sure, nearly everybody who is engaged in scientific pursuits and industrial pursuits and so forth, they have a rationalization for why what they're doing is essential to the survival of humanity. And so we have transhumanist worldviews about enhancing ourselves through technological extensions and so forth. And we have transhumanists who not only argue that some of those will serve all of our needs, but we can distribute them broadly so we can radically extend human life for everyone. But some of us have the concern, is that what's really going to occur? Or are we just using techno-solutionism to create an elite?
Yeah.
So my concern is how we kind of transcend this moment in history that is still, at least within the West, individually dominated, and how we bring in a better integration of philosophies, whether those are indigenous or whether those are Buddhist or Hindu. I don't really care exactly which philosophies we focus on, but an appreciation that whereby individualism may be nice in our developmental stages as teenagers go through a sense of individuating themselves from their parents or their community, that ultimately it's an immature take on what this world is, that we are basically all a nexus of consciousness and a sea of relationships. And if we don't recognize that, and if we don't try and find ways to embody that in our actions, we can be as rich as we want to be, but we are not really mature representations of human possibility.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Vishakha. I was going to comment, but I'll do this afterwards. Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I think that, when we think about human consciousness, oftentimes when I talk to my colleagues who are IR specialists, let's say international relations people, and they'd say, yeah, it's all well and good to think about interdependence and collective consciousness, but you know what? It doesn't work. Look at how much we fight. Look at how much we are actually completely polarized. So my answer to that is to say that human beings are capable of the ultimate atrocities. We know that. We can divide and conquer and we can do all that because power is part of the human nature, but we are also capable of having that higher level of consciousness that is about awareness of others in relation to us. It isn't noblesse oblige to say, I'm going to help those people. What COVID, if anything, it has taught us is that, you know what? If we don't deal with this, we're doomed. And climate crisis in front of us tells us that. So there's some urgency to this. And it is to shift that consciousness to say, yeah, the glass is maybe 3/4 empty, lots of problems, but there is that 1/4 that you could make the glass fuller. What are you going to do? How are you going to actually make that glass fuller towards a collective consciousness, towards a collective responsibility? It's not that that is all the way only thing to do, but we have really destroyed that idea of interdependence in the global sense. Is causing more problems right now for us, even though we've done lots of other things. So, as Wendell was saying, so some people, they say science is like climate. It knows no borders. It's completely neutral. And I was talking to a oceanographer, and she is involved with finding blue whales. And she's talking about when she found these blue whales in Sri Lanka, and she talked to her colleagues who are oceanographers in the global north, the first thing they said is, "Oh, fabulous. Can you get me a permit to do work in Sri Lanka? And then you can kind of help me do this stuff." And she said, this is like colonial presence, and it has to do with power structure. So what are we going to do about dismantling the notions of privilege and power? And that's what Wendell was getting at, that, there are people who have benefited exponentially more by having this system, and we got to call it out.
Yeah, and thanks. I'll both maybe thoughts that just got triggered by both Wendell and Vishakha's comments, and then maybe Yolanda, I'll turn to you to get your thoughts. But for me, I think it was interesting, Wendell, how you pointed out the notion of incentives, right? And it's a good thing to say we should move from individualism to being much more collective, but what's in it for me needs to be answered, so that actually you bring people along, you bring systems along. And I think we need collectively to rethink these incentive systems, and that does not exist yet, and it will require sort of collective minds coming to the table. And I do think, Vishakha, I like your points around the glass being half full, and maybe focusing a little bit more on the half full and all the very positive stories. Some of them might be anecdotal indeed, right? But COVID really, I think, unleashed some very positive behaviors in the world, and there is for sure lessons to take before everything and everyone reverts to a world as we knew it before. And I think that notion of saying, well, it is a moment of disruption, there is positive change coming out of it, let's harness it and get to something bigger, is quite positive to finish on. Maybe Yolanda, your thoughts, and then we'll be looking to open it up to the many questions I see coming through from the audience today.
Yeah, thank you. I want to reflect on Vishakha's point about this domination of one system into another. So, for example, I'm myself a scientist, but I'm also an indigenous people. So I have these two sides in my brain. So I can think as a scientist because I got a degree from a very well-recognized university, but also I still have the knowledge I acquired from my ancestors about how to take care of our mother nature. And I want to comment here that how this domination is still playing a very important point in how science is defined, in how the conservation sector is playing the rules of the game. So, for example, research involving indigenous peoples have been performed, defined, developed, carried out, but primarily by Western indigenous researchers. And this is not bad, but the problem here is that indigenous knowledge is getting even more eroded. If we consider that there has been several, a very, very deep erosion of this knowledge. And my point here is that it's important to change this, particularly in the conservation policy and scientific sector, in terms of allowing indigenous peoples or giving back their voices to protect nature in the way they have been doing over centuries, over millennia. And so these power imbalances can be removed at some point. And this can be done like the way I'm doing it. So I'm a scientist. I possess knowledge about the scientific understanding of our planet, but also I had this other knowledge, which is also very valuable because our local communities, our indigenous communities have been using it over the years, and it's functioning without romanticizing it, of course.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Yolanda. I think this was a very good start to the conversation, and very much looking forward to continue it. I think I'm going to turn to Antonia to now moderate the Q&A, and very much looking to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Alora. Thank you for the fantastic discussion. It's been wonderful to listen in, and I see that in the chat we're having quite a few questions popping in. I do want to encourage everyone who's listening in to continue to populate the chat, and if based on the flow of the discussion, please watch out on the chat. For someone from the Salzburg team might be in touch with you so that you can ask your question directly to our panelists. So up first, we have our first questionnaire from Diana Delgadillo Ramirez. She is a research manager at the Hunger Project, and she is going to be joining us from Mexico. She is our Health and Healthcare Innovation Fellow. So I already see her up. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you, Antonia. Thank you all for the chance to ask this on what Vishakha was saying related to what's missing, and Yolanda about putting the indigenous voices and action in the center, and Wendell with the technology and biology innovations. But what I want to ask and share with you is that, is there not a contradiction between the innovation that we're seeking and the traditional forms of knowledge that we're seeking to go back to? Because we know that innovation is like looking for something new, like all the time, or this might be what we understand. And what if we are the ones who need to be innovative on how to understand these dynamics that are happening into territories, and us, maybe the outsiders, to understand what's happening inside? And I don't want to fall into these explanations of them and us and these divisions, but for me, this is the opportunity for calling the decolonization of knowledge, of politics, and of course development, and being innovative or being someone who's in innovation. It's not only we need to stop thinking that that's only linked mainly to technology. And this is, I think, or I also want to hear, what do you think about that this is a time for being disruptive, which might be different from being innovative. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Diana, for your question. Yolanda or anyone else would like to take a crack at that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Diana, for your interesting point. One thing I would like to bring here is that Indigenous peoples are not against being innovative. Actually, there are many indigenous technologies and innovations. So, for example, around climate change, in the past, indigenous communities from the past, they haven't heard a lot about climate change, but now they are facing climate change, they are fighting against climate change, and they are adapting with innovations in the effects of climate change. So, and one important point here is that for us, the time is not linear. For us, it's cyclical. And we are always looking at the future, but not in a way that, not as with an ending point. So the future is a point in which we should also renovate, and nature again is at the center of this conception of the future of the time. So we don't want to live longer. We want to live the time we need to live in this planet for the protection of the planet, for the future generations. And this vision is what is missing in other Western approaches, that human life is just a very tiny part of this whole complex universe.
I don't think we should have any illusion that we're going backwards. And I also think, as important as it is to have Indigenous voices, some people will point out that Indigenous voices, at least population-wise, represent a pretty small percentage of those on the planet right now. Though, interestingly enough, they actually sit on a vast amount of the actual resources, of the actual systems out there. So how that will all be integrated, I don't know. And I think here we're probably talking more about wisdom that was expressed in indigenous communities that has not been integrated very effectively into the modern worldview. It's not a mystery to anybody listening into this particular podcast that we're at a very tenuous moment. There is what Jürgen Habermas called a legitimation crisis. Public is losing confidence, trust that our leaders really know how to even meet the challenges at hand. And there is a tension between those who are ready to write it off and turn inward and seek their own protection, and those of us of a more internationalist perspective who are still hopeful of establishing a more constructive, inclusive way forward. But even on the internationalist front, it's pretty well dominated from the top down. And those voices that are not already in power patronizingly make decisions about who the other voices are going to be at the table. So one of the things we need to do is whether we're going to be able to reform the existing internationalist multilateral system, that's up for grabs. But I think we can begin to try and put institutions in place that are more reflective of where we think the society should be moving. And one of the things we do need to do is not only bring more voices to the table, but to find ways in which many of the communities, and I don't just mean indigenous people or women or those from the global south, but I also mean consumers, those with disabilities. We could go on, find ways in which they can come to the table. There are many forums like this, and perhaps one of the things we can do is help those communities create their own networks so that they can elect their own representatives or select their own representatives to the many international bodies which are trying to work through these problems. And hopefully that would at least integrate a more balanced perspective as we discuss how we're going to move forward in the midst of this rather difficult period in history.
Right. This is an incredibly important discussion, and just to keep the momentum going, I would like to bring in our next questionnaire. Thank you, Diana, for joining us. That was fantastic. And now we have Shahid Fada joining us. He is a professor in Archie Mefehe Chair in Critical and Decolonial Humanities at the University of Cape Town, and he's joining us from South Africa. Welcome, Shahid.
Thank you. Really exciting and very insightful discussion. But I'll get straight to my question, and I think it takes off from where Wendell left off. But it also refers to the last Enlightenment, and presumably also the Enlightenments that occurred both in India and in China, where apart from the emphasis given to individualism and democracy, it was also about rationality and scientific advancement as integral to progress. However, as we have learned, this was at the cost of indigenous knowledge and a respect for justice. And I guess also in the colonial context, the great disadvantages that have befallen colonial and then post-colonial countries. But the question really is, what will be the new alternative for a new, different Enlightenment? How will it advance progress in a more equitable and just way, without denying people their historic backgrounds and advances in science? What terms of engagement will be best suited to recognize the injustices of the past, by setting up modes of discussions which will for those that were seriously disadvantaged? And how can the one-sided rationality of science and technology that people have raised repeatedly now How will this make progress to a more just future, especially in the light of climate change? Thank you.
Thank you, Shahid. Vishakha, would you maybe, or anyone else from the speakers, would you maybe want to respond to Shahid's questions? I think you are on mute. Vishakha, sorry.
Unmuted.
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
So terrific to see you, Shahid, again. And as usual, you always ask an important question, and that is, how are we going to do this? The what may be a little bit clearer than the how. And the how, I often find that I think that one of the problems is that when we think of innovation and creativity, often it is thought of as only something new. And I always go back to, and maybe that's my own training, but in Sanskrit, the word creativity is really about, in the early Vedic tradition, is about new insight, not necessarily newness as opposed to oldness. And therefore, you could find new insight into even something that has existed before. And that's the wisdom part, that you come in to see something that isn't just to say, oh, all this is wrong, now mine is the right. But it is to find new way of looking at even things that are all around us. And that goes back for me to what Wendell was saying about collective intelligence. That is beyond science, but it is something that is actually to redefine intelligence and wisdom coming together. So, I mean, I love the fact that in Buddhism, wisdom and knowledge are two different aspects that need to come together. And that, I think, it sounds very airy-fairy and philosophical, but that means that you first have to recognize the limits of what you've done and be humble and recognize also the destructive aspect of what we have done. And so we can't just have people at the table unless we're also willing to say the collective enterprise is to change the shape of the table. It isn't just about whose voices are heard, but who's going to make the decision and how that decision is going to be made. So when you talk to young people, and all the studies show that young people are most frustrated with the limits of the systems that we have today. And that has to be recognized. All the multilateral systems that are really nation state based are showing us the limits of what they can do from the UN. And at the same time, in some ways, one could argue that the success of collective was actually what people were able to figure out about COVID so quickly and how they were able to come together. So there is some progress in terms of how people come together, share the knowledge, and try to come up with something. How do we create more of that, of sharing different knowledge systems to come up with new solutions, bearing in mind that our goal has to be equity, justice, and recognizing the wrongs that were caused by the past? We just have to do that. Because without that, some things will just stay right there without actually dealing with, and that's why my colleague that I gave the example of, the oceanographer, and she actually called those scientists out to say, I found the thing, you now want to do the work, without actually involving how the indigenous people have been working with this in Sri Lanka. Not indigenous as we define in the UN system, but the local folks. And she refused to just say, I'm just going to do it. But that has to be called out. And it's a lot of work. I mean, the thing we're talking about will take decades, but you have to start somewhere. And how we're going to do it is to do with who's at the table and what are we going to do with the table.
Let me jump in for a minute on this also. I think we have a difficulty here, and that's that the Cartesian Enlightenment took place over a couple centuries, and it probably took another century or two to really come into focus what its impact was. And it, yes, did start as a bunch of ideas. And now we're caught between the problem of trying to put in place new ideas or empower older ideas to reset the imbalances we have. And we don't have a few centuries to get it right. Technology is moving at a tremendous pace. Global climate change is moving at a tremendous pace where there's need for action. And we aren't going to be able to get it all right. And though we are trying to underscore some of the values that we would like to have put in place, that's perhaps going along better than might be hoped. But I think the pandemic has also showed us how poorly that has been in terms of looking at a global crisis as being global and not just being saving our own national interests or our own people. So I think we need to start putting in place at least a few operational principles that go beyond this intellectual shift that we hope to see better embodied. And I mean, the front in which I work on is ethics and governance. How can we put in place new mechanisms? I don't happen to think of ethics as being about some binary right or wrong or the greatest good for the greatest number. I think of it as how do we navigate uncertainty and the many uncertainties of the futures we're moving into. And I would like to see one thing put in place. I would say that if you're going to introduce a technology, and let us understand that every choice we make has trade-offs. Every choice we make can have secondary and tertiary impacts which may not be beneficial. So once we start recognize that, we can start saying to those who are introducing new technologies, not some simplistic precautionary principle that may get in the way of introducing a technology that could be tremendously beneficial, but saying that if you're going to introduce a destabilizing force into the human society, then you have to simultaneously be addressing the trade-offs, be addressing the ways in which that new institution can be leading to impacts that are either harmful or potentially undesirable. And if not, you don't have a right to introduce that technology. And secondly, in introducing that technology, to understand the trade-offs, you need to be presenting those before these multicultural forums so that you can be attuned to some of the trade-offs you might not be otherwise. Meaning that if it's going to affect their lives, it's not just a few powerful industrialists at the top who make changes that are going to dramatically transform humanity. There was a cautionary story from a few years ago about the introduction of yellow rice. Yellow rice may actually have been one of the most beneficial technologies ever developed. It was developed to cure vitamin D deficiency that was causing blindness in children. And not only that, nearly every aspect of it was done in an ethical way. It was not owned by a corporation. Its ownership was put in the public domain, but they made one major fault in the way it was introduced. They didn't consult the leaders of the communities that it was being introduced into. They didn't have those conversations with the communities about what it meant to introduce those technologies. So we have created a society where apparently a few are able to introduce dramatically transformative technologies without consulting those of us who are going to be affected by them. And to be sure, we don't always know what the effects will be. Sometimes they are slow in coming. But that has to be one of the first things that we declare unacceptable.
Thank you, Wendell. And Shahid, thank you so much for your intervention. I think precisely this is why it's so important to have these conversations. And Vishakha, I did really enjoy that bit of changing the shape of the table. I would like to, and I know because I do want to give an opportunity to bring in as many people as we can. So I'd like to move on to our next questionnaire. David Gleason, he is a consultant at the IT for Progress. He will be joining us from the United States. He is also, if I may mention, a friend of Salzburg Global and a son of our fourth founder, Herb Gleason. I hope he will be able to, yeah, and he is here. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. My question is quick and pretty simple. Can we give up on the idea that money and power are still good and valuable pursuits that are basic human nature? None of that needs to be true. The Enlightenment's individualistic success is now an extreme where individuals have so much money and power that they are basically their own states. What if it didn't feel safer to have more money? What if it became more of a problem? And the cautionary note would be tax the rich, which is now a popular phrase, at least in the States, can quickly become eat the rich if people become upset enough. So that's it. Thank you.
Vishakha, I see it seemed like you wanted to respond.
Well, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, but I also wanted to think about the last conversation we had too. I mean, I think about the French Revolution, you know. You could say, let them eat cake, and then what happens is a revolution. And so that can happen. I mean, given the situation we're in, it can happen. That's part of the inflection point. So I think that one of the other things that we have to think about is that it isn't that we are going to now move away from any sense of individual quality, but it is to redress the imbalance that is between the mutual responsibility and the individualistic entitlement. You know, the very fact that in America, people think of mask as it's my individual right, whether I wear it or not. And you say, no, mask is also about protecting you from others and others from you. It's called mutual responsibility. It isn't about just your own right. But that kind of issue really now, it's like a political issue. And you keep thinking, you know, this is an existential issue. Climate is an existential issue. And yet we can't get beyond that, especially in a place like America. So I think it's worth thinking about how do we balance the two so that you're not taking away some sense of individuality, but it is also to protect others from the kind of things, because it's going to ultimately affect you. So it's in the self-interest that you have to be mutual rather than it's here or it's over there. But I think going back to this idea of how, as Wendell was saying, the ethical question is about how to bring the possible downside at the forefront as you develop it. And I just wanted to say that I was in another gathering about education, and this was somebody who was at the Google Innovation Hub and has started his own company now, where they're looking at drones as being vehicles of transport, right? So kind of air taxis, if you will, through drone. And the question I had asked him, this was about 3 years ago, and I said, gee, have you thought about the implications of that on environment or what happens in the air, the noise pollution? And I kid you not, his answer was, that's not my problem. I'm here to innovate. Other people will have to figure that out. And I thought, how irresponsible is that? And then I talked to some other colleagues of mine at Columbia, and they were saying that all business of automation of the cars and self-driving cars, that most of these tests were done all in global north, in small places and small pockets, without any consideration of how it would actually go into big urban dense areas with many different kinds of practices, and that this question of ethics, how much, and that's a question for you, Wendell, how much does it actually come up in the artificial intelligence? I have a friend who's a neuroscientist, and he has started a whole movement of neuro rights, and that is to say, human rights we have dealt with, but you also have to think about the ethics of neurological advances in brain. And he feels that the ethical questions are not being addressed enough. So is this something that's a pie in the sky, or is this something that now is beginning to infiltrate more of the thinking of scientific advancements?
This is infiltrating, but there's a serious question about what's going on in terms of serious ethical deliberation and what's going on in terms of what's sometimes referred to as ethics washing. So Mark Zuckerberg, for example, in the last 48 hours has again pleaded mea culpa, but one of the medias I watch showed a long segment about the many times he has done that. And it's not clear that much happens. And to David's question, those with the inordinate economic and political influence are also have inordinate power to manipulate our beliefs and to really undermine our whole political structures as we're seeing today if it doesn't serve their interests. So there is a major distribution problem out there. We've seen that just in the distribution of vaccines and how those of us who are lucky to be among the 50% of the world that live in privilege are doing fine, and those of at least 50%, if not larger percentage of the population in poorer countries are not doing well at all. So we have a major distribution crisis, and I don't think the answer to it's going to be easy, and it may precipitate in revolutionary fervor in some countries. Unfortunately, some of the revolutionary fervors are going to be restructured toward inwardly turning nationalistic movements that don't necessarily address the challenge at hand. But yes, within the AI circles, within the emerging tech circles, those of us, and believe me, it was like a few dozen of us 15 years ago championing ethical considerations, have now become thousands, if not tens of thousands. It's just not clear yet whether that's really taking hold or not. The good news is that 10 years ago, most scientists from surveys we have seen would say that the societal impact of their research is not their problem. That's not the case anymore. We're seeing that it is being taken more seriously. So in that sense, we do have an ethics conversation underway, but as many of us know, particularly in the form of business ethics perhaps taught businessmen how to argue for what they were going to do anyways, as opposed to really changing behavior dramatically.
So the ethics washing.
The ethics washing. So, I mean, if any of you are interested, there happened to have been a short blog on the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs site that I just published yesterday, a little bit about this ethics washing question.
I see that Yolanda raised her hand.
Yes, only I just want to add a short comment that suddenly we are moving this conversation and we are focusing the conversation. For example, Vishakha just mentioned the importance of responsibility, mutual responsibility, individual to individual, and also the ethical aspect of research and the social impact of research. But we should also think about the importance of mutual responsibility, individual to nature, and science, the impacts of science and the ethical impact of science in not only in the social impact, but also the environmental impacts. And if we switch this, we can see that we are also thinking all the time individualistic. We need to change the approach and to think really about how we as humans affect nature. And regarding the question that was just brought to the table, you can have all the money in this world and you can go even to other worlds, but you won't have the beauty landscape we have every morning. We won't have the amazing oceans. So you can build your own house in Marte or in Mars, in another planet, but we won't have nature as we have it here. And we must respect it and we must think on the environment first.
Thank you, Yolanda, and thank you, David, for joining us. That was a great pleasure, and I do find it, as David has previously pointed out, sort of how do we get the people to think collectively together, and so that we can then move forward. I do have perhaps one final question that I'll read out. Unfortunately, our colleague had to drop off, but she submitted a question. Mary Helen Pombo, she's a program director at Salzburg Global, and she leads the Healthy Societies and Healthcare Innovation Series at our organization. So her question is moving away from human-centric language and thinking an important shift for the new Enlightenment? For example, our use of terms like humanizing, as if socio-emotional intelligence is unique to humans. Do we need a new taxonomy to help us make this shift? Maybe we need to draw on other languages and integrated knowledge systems, as Vishakha mentioned. Yolanda, maybe you want to take a first crack at that?
Yes, it was a very long question. So I just want to give a short answer. I think we don't need to complicate the things that much. As Vishakha mentioned, we sure can have a look of the past, what we already have, and bring it to the present, think about the future, but a future that shouldn't be decided only by current powers. So a future that should be decided by all the actors involved and all actors involved, I mean, indigenous peoples, marginalized communities, women, people with disabilities, etc. I think thinking about a new taxonomy, thinking about what we can do, shall we wait for a new enlightenment? Honestly, we don't have that much time.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, Diana, that the question is that it is about words we use and concepts we use. That's the reason why, in fact, we started this conversation, right? That what is behind the action? But as both Wendell and Yolanda have pointed out, we don't have a lot of time. So if we only talk about the concepts and the language, but we don't change the systems, we're doomed. So we need to actually chew gum and walk at the same time. And that means that we need to really do simultaneously many more things than we're doing. And I've always thought that how changes occur, it occurs partly in the hearts and minds. And how do you change education system? How do you change? So that's a long-term project. How do you actually inculcate these ideas at multiple levels? So that's at the grassroots education systems. But if you don't change policies and if you don't put some responsibilities and some accountability into place at the top level, we don't have the time. We got to do both. And we have to do both in a way so people demand that of their leaders, but leaders also have to do it because ultimately, otherwise they are made accountable. How do you do that?
I jump in for a second and just say, there's no shortage of people out there trying to come up with new languages, new phrases, new concepts, new powerful ways of trying to get across the key concerns we have here. Whether those are new or they draw on the past, it doesn't matter. There are plenty of people trying to enrich the conversation. The problem is the conversation still only includes a relatively small percentage of humanity. And the conversation we're having here is one actually we should all be having. There's so many things that we should all be engaged in an open discussion about the challenges we have able to today and the ways in which we might move forward. Unfortunately, this is still a relatively elite conversation going on, and that's not sufficient. But at least perhaps among those of us who are part of that elite, we're getting across to each other that a little humility is needed, that we need to be working more together, that we need to bring more voices in, that we need the public engaged in this conversation, and that with all of that, perhaps we can move together in a positive fashion.
Thank you, Wendell. That was a fantastic way to end the Q&A portion of the webinar. I want to say a deep thank you to all of our fellows and non-fellows who have submitted their questions into the chat. I know there was a lot of conversation going there, but we do need to move on to our wrap up, and I'm happy to now pass over to Elora.
Thank you very much, Antonia, and indeed quite impressive to see the chats coming through and a lot of, I would say, questions, but also sort of thoughts and suggestions. So as you say, Wendell, I think it's perhaps we can move to something else. And I like that light of hope, right? That I think is very much there in all the commentary. I'll maybe give some of my takeaways, and then I'll welcome each of you to give, you know, sort of what you take away from today's conversation. You know, in my mind, we started with why do we need a new enlightenment? And I quite like, Wendell, your point about, you know, the society is like a teenager, right? And there's a lot of immaturity in how we've behaved. And it's important to recognize it and recognize the mistakes of the past. And it's therefore time also to move on to something else. And indeed, I think the notion of environmental impact, social impact, are much more accepted than they were just 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. And so that's a positive sign of why we need something, and we need to move on from immaturity to maturity of some kind. On the question of how we're going to get there, quite like the, you know, the world as a family analogy, Vishakha, that you put out. I think, you know, also Yolanda, when you talked about bringing in other voices to the table, and that notion of mutual responsibility that all of us have to each other and to the rest of the living organism. I think it's important, and, you know, probably not so intuitive, to also say or hope that there is no contradiction between new innovation and new insights, and actually we can look to the past to find new ways to approach the current situation. I think that's reassuring if we can do it. And then finally, on, you know, where from there, right? And what are some signs of enlightenment that we heard today? I think just looking at a lot of the discussion in the chat, I think there is this notion that we need to dare to change and dare to bring in this new enlightenment. All of us, not just the elite, but really there is a role for, you know, start with those people on the seminar today, 300 people. There is a need to amplify that message and go out there and talk about it and bring others to the table in that conversation. So we all need to dare to talk about it. I think there's a lot of questions that were raised, and some of them we didn't have time to discuss, but, you know, what's the governance system that we're going to need to have? What is the price of nature? How do we bring a price to something that doesn't talk, right? And there is a lot of research, very interesting, going on in that space, which probably needs to be brought in. The regulation of artificial intelligence, of course, has been brought up, and I think that's a key question, which is being worked out. I don't think we have definitive systems yet. And you know, finally, the notion of, you know, what if we get it wrong? And are we heading towards a new revolution, French style or not French style? Not sure if that's good or bad, right? But, you know, should we eat the rich? And what does that mean for all of us and the knowledge systems as we know it, right? So that's my takeaways. I think a lot of very good and somewhat positive, I think, food for thought for all of us to act when we come out of this discussion. I'd love to invite the three of you maybe to play back the most provocative thought you take out from today, or something that you really, you know, stood out from your perspective from the discussion both we had, and then also with the fellows, of course.
Yeah.
And whoever wants to start.
Well, let me just say I'm watching the chats, and first of all, it's very impressive that we have lots and lots and lots of people who have commented. And one comment that came up is that maybe it should be a warning sign that all of us are agreeing too much. And that made me think of that's true in some way. So we might want to think a little bit more about where is the barrier to try to solve the problem? And what are we going to do about that? And be very mindful that the challenges are huge. And also, what might we lose in the process? So, if we're trying to redress this relationship of the individualism and mutual responsibility, what might we have to give up to do that? Or is it not a zero-sum game, that it's possible to do both? I doubt it. And so there is some question that, we had Robin Barons and the capitalism and all of that. There's nothing to do with Enlightenment. Guess what? There's pretty close connection right there. So it's not as if these things came out of nowhere, and that there is a colonialism and direct relationship to Enlightenment. So there is stuff that actually people need to know. So the first thing I would say is that knowing history is going to be important. Humility is going to be important. And recognize that while what to do might be clear, how to do it is not clear. But at some point, we're going to have to think about education system. And maybe being an educator, I think about that. And dimensions of regimes, systems, and policy. How do these come together will have to be put into account. But this does mean that it's all of us together and individually going out into our spaces that these kinds of conversations begin to happen, at least.
Thank you, Vishakha. Yolanda, you want to go next?
Yeah, well, my general thought about this conversation is that, from my perspective, of course, is that any new enlightenment will be pointless if we don't accept other ways of knowing our nature and our earth systems, and also if we do not reestablish our relationship with nature. And that's the only message I would like to give here.
Thank you, Yolanda. And Wendell, concluding remarks?
So, excuse me, I have to get my mute button off. I'm deeply concerned. I mean, I'm getting to be a senior citizen, and I understand that apocalypticism is kind of a natural viewpoint for those as they get older, as at least they start to witness their own extinction date. But it seems to me that some of the voices out there are getting shriller on all sides. And I'm not sure that the younger generation is going to sit patiently by while those of us who are gray eminences, proclaim that we need this or we need that. I'm happy to witness certain things. For example, on this panel, I am the token male. That's actually good news, and that's happened to me increasingly. But I also become concerned that it's perhaps happening to me because there aren't enough voices out there who are able to move around in a transdisciplinary way and talk about the very issues that we're touching upon today. These are big subjects. And we aren't really developing the cadre of younger people able to lead the way. And that's a serious failing. We need to not just develop a lot of specialists, we need to develop a whole generation of young people who can have this conversation and lead the way through them. Let's be clear, many of them understand the impacts of what's going on much better than those of us on this panel. They understand the technologies, they understand the extent to which their political and purchasing behavior is being manipulated constantly. And hopefully they're developing the kinds of self-understanding that will forge ways of transcending that. But whether or not that's true is unclear at this moment. And I'm afraid those of us who are older have failed the next generation in not providing the appropriate resources to give them both the experiences and the opportunities to have richer worldviews and to take leadership roles in these discussions.
Thank you, Wendell. And I maybe just my final thoughts, and then we wrap up. I think there is for sure, to Yolanda's point, a need to rethink the relationship with nature. And I think what's beautiful about it is people can do it at the individual level, at the organizational level, at the national level. It's really an issue or a possibility that transcends sort of the different levels. And I think maybe something everyone should take away from this conversation. And I think it's nice to see so much interaction in the chat, and there are so many new pockets of innovation out there on how to think about, just to single out a few, but I think the ethics of artificial intelligence and the pricing of nature, etc., which we've mentioned in this conversation. I think it is very reassuring that this is very much top of mind, I think, for the young generation, and that the frameworks are starting to emerge, and there is potentially a lot of dialogue that will still happen on those topics. I'd like to close. I would like very much to thank my three speakers for this fantastic conversation. I have enjoyed very much this exchange of point of views coming from very different perspectives, very different fields of research. And I think that has really allowed for a rich conversation, which again, in my view, is maybe the beginning of more conversations to have. I also like to remind people on the line that there is an upcoming Designs on the Future session happening on November 18th. The topic for the next one will be, how can we move from climate crisis to climate justice? Yet another expansive question with fantastic speakers to discuss it. If you are interested to know more or to sign up to our seminars, you will find all the links in the chat. We'll also put up a poll just now where you can tell us how much you enjoyed the conversation. And it's a very quick question, yes, partly or no. So please do fill it in. We're looking forward to seeing your feedback. And I'd like to thank all my colleagues who made this seminar possible, the speakers again, and all the participants for the very active chat and questions. And I want to thank everyone for today's discussion.